Hello everybody and welcome to this research seminar at the Institute for Future Studies. My name is Gustav Arrhenius. Now with the situation we will have all the audience online, but hopefully that will work very well. And of course I'm sure there is a lot of thinking of what's going on in the United States, but we're going to focus on something else. We have very happy to have Björn Åstrand here. He's going to speak about equality and equity in Swedish education policy, practice and historical perspective. And the historical perspective, I guess, is fitting because you are a professor of history at the Department of Historical, Philosophical and Religious Studies at Umeå University. And I guess a bit way back, you actually wrote a thesis on torture and painful interrogation.
Yeah, that's true.
Violence and coercion in older Swedish law.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how much of that you're using in what you're talking about today. But since quite a long time ago, or at least since August 2017, you've been working full-time at the Ministry of Education and as an investigator there. And you already in 2015, you were a member of the School Commission. And you have now recently presented this white paper or study on how to make the Swedish schools more equal and have more equity in the schools. And that's what you're going to talk about today. So welcome, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gustav. Thank you for the invitation to come here. And thank you for introducing me. I would also like to add that in fact I'm a school teacher from the 1980s. That's where I started as teaching in school, teaching history and religion in secondary school. So that is my background, and from there I was recruited to Umeå University, where I am a senior lecturer in educational work nowadays. So that's something about my background, and as you of course alluded to, my historical background could pop up in this presentation as well today. I have tried to design this in that I start with a kind of a short introduction, and then I say something about the task for the inquiry I was responsible for, and then I spend some time on the concept of equity and equality, and thirdly, then I would dig into and present some part of the how the current situation looks like in our schools today. And then I try to offer a kind of a theoretical understanding of how we can think about policy alternatives here. And after summing up, if there are time, I prepared also a short to say something about the role as a researcher in this kind of policy producing context, because I think it is quite challenging to be a researcher in this context. So that is what I have sort of planned for. But as an introduction, I have decided to show you two I'll give you some pieces from two recent studies that in fact have come out just the last month, and then I will give you an historical example before I proceed. So just some weeks ago, a report from the European Commission, they have looked into a lot of things based on on PISA results, but what kind of maybe is most striking for us is the fact that they show that the achievement gap when it comes to reading literacy in Sweden is among the highest in Europe, and that is a kind of an observation that is in stark contrast to our historical heritage, because the Swedish school system have had the capacity to produce, to educate with a very low level of achievement gap. And a study already in the 70s, that is 10 years in the history of the school model that was established in the 60s, they found out that when I looked into the Swedish school, what the student, the achievement among our students, there was the smallest variation from school to school, and they were quite impressed about how this sample was uniform in score levels, meaning that almost all students, they were quite advanced in their reading comprehension, but the variation was also very low. So that is a kind of the history we have behind us, and this recent report says that is something totally different today. And they also note that at the time it was a lot of discussion of talent, and they noticed that talent, when they looked into those scores, they said talent tends to be spread with an even hand over the different schools over the country. That gives an indication of also a low differentiation of students in our school. So that was the first comment. A recent study with one scholar from Stockholm University and one from Södertörns University College. It is a study where they have been doing observations in classroom, and they try to pinpoint what kind of teaching their students in those schools receive. And what they find is that students that are from higher socioeconomic background, they receive a more qualified, committed and motivated teachers that are teaching them. In those schools there is an intense parental engagement in the studies, etc., etc. So what they more or less identify is that students with very strong background, they receive a high level of education. Students with weaker background receive something else. So they also comment that what we are seeing here, that is a mechanism that facilitates the intergenerational transmission of advantage. So with those two pictures saying, first, hi guys, you have a high achievement gap in the outcome from your classes, from education in Sweden. And secondly, look here, it seems like you have kind of a parallel system where students that are rather well off already, they receive the best teaching, and students that are in need of a high level of support, they are not granted that. So that was sort of where I would like to start, because this says something about the importance of education. And now, Gustav, there will be an historical example though. At the moment I'm looking into older literature on teaching and education, and I found this quite interesting from 1880s. So in this volume they discuss what is education about, and with this picture they try to make clear what happens if you don't receive a proper education. Look here, I translate what is in there. So if you have the child in the beginning, and if it receive with a red text and line, if you receive a nice education, you go to school, you go to further studies, you make a successful career, and you will have an honorable aging. On the other hand, if you don't receive that education, there will be the street, they will go to the streets, there will be alcoholism, misery and vice, it will be begging and disdain. That's the thing. And yeah, we could laugh at this, but this is more or less have relevance for today as well. Those of our students in our schools which we fail to give the proper support so they become successful in teaching, in fact, they have less good opportunities for living a good life. That's what it's all about, so to say. So, to the point, the very issue of educational equity becomes, according to my understanding, more and more important rather than less important. And why is that? because education seems to become more important than such. So that the consequence of that is that if we don't provide high quality education for all students, then there will be consequences. So, having said this, we can start to think about what kind of problem is the problem of education. And we could think about it, from many perspectives. And I will, in this presentation, try to bring up some aspects of this. But we also need to have with us the question of what kind of problem is the problem of equity in education. What does that entail for a kind of problem for us? And I would say from the beginning, at a starter on this conversation, I would say that we need to at least think about what we understand with education. In Swedish context, I understand that we tend to not make a clear distinction between schooling and education. And where schooling is very much about qualification and being prepared for work life. However, education is a wider concept that has to do with qualification for work life, for a life as an active citizen, but it also has to do with socialization, makes it possible for us to interact together. It is also about what is called subjectification, to become a person, to find your inner dreams, sort of your passions, what would you like to be. So that I put here in red, and it's interesting that in the 70s there was a UN report who was very clear on this, that education is not only about qualification, it is important, but it's also something about learning to be. That was sort of a wider concept. And my point is that if we have a very narrow concept of education, we tend to neglect school as a place for Bildung, shared values, as an institution for democracy and societal progress. And if that is combined with a narrow notion of what equity is, I think we tend then that there is a risk that we neglect huge and future consequences for humans and society. So that's sort of to say what this is about. So if we have just at least as a starter said something about what the problem could be here at stake, I will now say something about the assignment I had from the government. What kind of report was I supposed to do? In fact, I didn't bring it with me. It's like 800 pages. Sometimes I bring it with me just sort of, I think it gives me some kind of security to have it with me. And I kind of like to carry that one with me. But as 2 years earlier, I presented another inquiry for the government, and that is also on kind of 800 pages. It seemed to be heavy to carry them around, so I haven't done that. So the task I was assigned to take on from fall 2018 was to chair an inquiry thinking about how we could increase equity through reduced school segregation and improved resource allocation. So when I think about this, I know this kind of an iron triangle around this. This has been my kind of working model for me in this work. And this is where school segregation, it points towards question about school choice, school market, and steering, how we govern education. And resource allocation poses some other questions. From where, to what level, in what respect should be needs-based, etc., etc. So that is kind of the two main directions for the inquiry. During this work, I have sent a strong feeling for what else can contribute. If we should really try to think about what could be the most important to do, I would have preferred to have that task as my first task, sort of the wide task. But I didn't have that in my directive. I had those two directions. But in a final chapter in the report, I in fact took the opportunity to reflect upon what else can contribute. The policy context for this is, as Gustav alluded to, the School Commission, and as I think many of you would prefer to have this in English, I have made a translation of this. So this picture is that's the national strategy which we produced in the School Commission. It's a nice picture, and I asked that we need to be able to say, to sort of condense our message into one picture. I don't know whether it is that easy to read, but at least I've tried to make a translation so it could be available for you later. I just want to say that this is the context. We did this work with the School Commission with 2015 to 2017, and after that there have been a number of inquiries taking pieces further that we couldn't really deal with in this work. So I have this today. I'm presenting this one, and 2 years ago I had that task to work with teacher quality, so to say. I think also I would like to mention that to me, at least, when I was called, would you like to participate and work in a school commission? I think that was a very particular task, because we had one in 1918, and then we had a second in 1946, and this was the third one. We have a great number of inquiries, but the kind of a school commission was something else. I think particularly the one from 1946 was extremely important, because they made a kind of look. This is what I was thinking about when I received the question. They looked out in Europe and in the world, and they said, okay, we need to change our education. We have seen a period of totalitarian ideologies. We have seen devastating world war. We need to redesign our educational system for the future, for new challenges, for a more democratic society. So for me, that was an extremely important task. So this is the policy context. This inquiry, which I present some pieces of here today, it is sort of an outflow from that work. So with this introduction, I will just end this by giving you a kind of a very quick input to what everyone can identify if you spend 1.5 hours with the national statistics, nowadays again available on the website of Skolverket. So I know that many of you are excellent researchers, and you are looking very sort of detailed into material and describe very sort of important patterns. But I would like to show you what anyone can, I'm an historian, I'm not a statistician, I'm not a mathematician, but what anyone can find if you look into those figures for an hour. And if we start here and think about that in the Education Act, we have a promise to all students, says that it shouldn't matter where you are born or where you go to school. So here I just took spent some time, and I looked into data for all the counties in Sweden. And I was thinking about how much variation do we have in between counties. And then you have to think that counties here, that is kind of a huge block of students. And I was looking into how many have passed the requirements in each subject. And to my mind, at least, if we find that, yes, in some counties it's below 70%, and in some it's above 80%, says that there are consequences. Where you are born have consequences when you go to school. So this is something that anyone can figure out. And in the Education Act, we have another promise to everyone, to every kid, and parents, is to say that it shouldn't matter what parents you have. Your history shouldn't matter, because our school system are designed to compensate for disadvantage. So here I have taken 4 counties: Södermanland, Jönköping, Norrbotten and Stockholm. And I have just taken the same figures as last time, but I've organized it according to whether You see in blue line whether parents have higher education, whether you are non-immigrant, whether sort of your gender, female, it's the here the gray one, etc. And you can see it's the same pattern in all counties. And when I look into this, if you look into one municipality, you can see the same pattern. So the consequences here are that, yes, the capacity for the Swedish school to compensate for your history, for in which family you were born, it's not really there. So to sum up this part, yes, there are high variations. Anyone can observe that. That is a question of inequality. And you can see that the educational system as such doesn't remedy this, the background. So we have systematic differences in achievement depending on your background. And as I commented earlier, if you look into every city and also every school, you can find the same pattern. And for me, this is highly challenging. So now over to next part, and I will say something about those concepts of equity and equality. Now, Gustav, you said, yes, it should be on high scientific level. I don't know whether this represents this. This is a kind of a classic cartoon saying that, yeah, for a fair selection, everyone has to take the same exam. Please climb the tree. And we have the fish in the bowl, and we have the elephant, and we have the monkey. Yeah, this is of course a kind of a ridiculous way to approach this, but I would say that difference makes difference. So then the question will be, how do we understand equality and equity in education from this perspective? And then I will say something about how it's understood in our legislation. And then it is about, the first bullet point there, it is about equal access to education of high quality for all. The second is about equal opportunities for all students to become successful. And the third is what I have talked about earlier, sort of that our school system are, according to legislation, supposed to take a particular approach to each and every one with higher needs and to support them in a better way. So more or less, it is about providing every child with such opportunities that they have their future in their own hand. It shouldn't be a product of their history. So that is what the kind of promise to parents and kids are. And when I talk about this, I receive questions.
Sorry, the thing below there, is that where does that come, that educational equity is about providing every child with opportunities?
Yeah, this is my sort of comment.
That's your interpretation of what's about.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for the clarification. And I would also say finally that I receive a lot of questions. So is equality or equity, is it about treating everyone in the same manner? Is it to offer everyone kind of a standardized or a uniform set? I will comment a bit more on that later on. Yes, in some respect it could be about that, but it also have to do with doing different to be able to achieve the same goal, as humans are different, so to say. This is a picture that many teachers recognize, and I showed, in fact, this to a kid of 5 years old age recently, and I asked him, what do you say about this picture? And he looked at it and he said, yes, I think it's fair that they have taken the boxes in a way so that everyone can watch the game. And also he commented that the tallest one, he's not restricted in his view of the game being out, not having a box to stand on. This is a classic, it is well known among teachers in Sweden, and I liked it, so I also brought it in the final report. As you can see here, it's the same model here. So equality have a kind of main connotation towards this concept of equal access, whether equity more draws towards this with opportunity for everyone. So if we sort of take that a bit further, equality come close to many much questions. Equal access to what? On what conditions? How? And with what quality? That is a kind of question that comes up in connection to equality in education. And the main focus tends to be about standardization and uniformity and things like that. On the other hand, equity draws more towards what can we do to make it possible for every student to become successful? With what methods? How can we do that? And to what degree would that be? Then we'd come over to questions about differentiation. How do we need to differentiate schooling to make it possible for everyone to be successful? So there are key aspects here in those concepts that I have experienced that many of in the conversation where I present the work I've done, people get a bit sort of frustrated. So what is this about? And I try to point that, yes, it is a kind of a partly messy field. There is a history about the concept. We can think about it from the 70s. It was a very much of a wide concept, points toward huge societal challenges of equality. And at that time, when it was the period when building up a new educational system, there was a focus on emphasizing uniformity and so on. But also with the concept at the time, it was a lot about shared values and frames of reference and things like that. Then in the late 80s and the 90s, we had a kind of a more narrow understanding of it. And the concept became sort of applicated to other parts of the educational system. It was connected to freedom of choice, for example, or parents' right, or the rights for the school providers, or something like that. So I would say that that since the 1990s we have kind of a narrowing understanding of this, and the concept as such is quite politically sensitive. I think this is an advertise from the election of 1948, and I'm sure that many of you have seen this. The message is, yes, this guy is gifted, but he's poor. Offer him equal opportunities, and then you should go vote, so to say. It is a concept that is sensitive politically. I think my understanding is that many people agrees on the importance of equity and or equality, but when it comes to how can we do that, then we differ in our understandings. That was something about the concept. And then I would like to look into some other with some slides, I will try to say something more about the current situation, and I will focus on financial resources in education, school segregation, and teacher competence. With those three, which I understand as essential resources to allocate wisely in an educational system. I have to apologize that I haven't followed all those advices to not have that much text on my slides. My experience is that people usually want to look at slide afterwards. So when I just have my nice picture without text and a lot of nice views, I think it's better sometimes to offer, and at least in this context, to offer more of texts. When we looked into this issue about resources, in the inquiry, the first comment we had to deal with was the quite dominating idea that financial resources are of very little value for the educational level and quality. I think it's interesting. I have visited a number of schools during my years, and I never heard that comment from a school teacher. Seldom from a principal. They know that they are dependent of resources. I can hear that from school directors, for example, and I always hear it from, nearly always, it's most common on the political level, that this is not important. When we looked into this, and when we summarize in the report, what do we know about that? We could say that, yes, 10 years ago, a wave of new studies came up, and they show that with new methodology, they show that, yes, resources are important. And they show that they have greater impact in more poorly financed schools than other schools. They show that they have financial resources have more importance for kids from disadvantaged families, etc., etc. So that's where we start in this inquiry. That's where sort of our point of departure. Resources are important. I just take an example from a rather recent book on school financing, who shows that they have followed up due to the opportunity in US with a lot of tax reform. They could, in fact, follow how changes occurs over the country. And they claim that a 10% of increase in per pupil spending each year for all 12 years in school, they can connect that to higher wages for those kids later on in life. I don't know whether that is the best prediction or what it says, but it says that, yes, probably resources have an impact also on what kind of job you will hand in the end. And probably that has to do with how well educated you became, etc., etc. So that was my first comment. Yes, resources are important. Then, in our inquiry, we looked into all the 291 municipalities in Sweden. We have them here. Every stripe here is a municipality. And we looked into what kind of level of investment in education do they do in each municipality. And by the way, I call it investment. In our terminology is cost. But I think it's more sort of ideologically correct to say that it is an investment in next generation. So what we find here is that we have a quite significant variation. You can see that there is a maximum of nearly 887,000 and the minimum of nearly the half. And if we take away sort of the most extreme part, we say probably there could be some misunderstanding in the reporting there. There is still a difference between the 95th and the 5th percentile for 45,000 crowns, and that is quite a significant part. So then we try to dig into this to try to understand this. So we adjust for local cost. There are systems for this, you know. So that it's nothing that we have invented. It's something that we do all the time in agencies and in the governance of Sweden. So we adjust for local costs. We adjust for social economic status, SES, and we check for immigration, etc. And still, we have a difference of 38,000 crowns. And that says that among the 30 highest, you have a significant level compared with the lower. It has to be said that, you know, we have a reimbursement system nationally between municipalities. So this is, after all that, we still have this variation. So remember what I said earlier. Resources are important. The problem here is that we have variation that is unexplained. We could say, yeah, it could have with efficiency, or it could have with something else to do. We find that wealthy municipalities invest more in their children. Taken together, we can see that those responsible units, municipalities are in Sweden responsible for funding schools. They don't allocate resources on aggregate level towards need. Within municipalities, they have different system for bringing more resources where kids have higher needs, but on national level it is a negative relation. So this is an important finding in our inquiry. So that was about financing. Now we'll say something about school segregation. And I might comment why I understand it as a resource. Because students, every teacher knows that students in classrooms are a resource, depending on what kind of mix of students and on which level they are. It is one of several resources for teaching. And when we discuss this with school segregation, I have to start with commenting about the Coleman report. Some of you are familiar with it. It was the kind of a follow-up 10 years after the desegregation policy went through in United States after Brown versus Board of Education. And they looked into, so what has happened? And the first comment they made is that 80% of all white pupils attend schools that are 90 to 100% white. So the first comment is that when we talk about segregated school, everyone assumes it's a school for the black or for the minority we are talking about. But the first comment they made is that segregation is a kind of relational concept, and it has to do with also affluent societies and white kids. Yeah, and what is also commented in research is about the negative impact on learning and society and society as such. As a kind of way to sum up the research on this, I went to a statement from Linda Darling-Hammond. She was invited to so this would be the connection to the election we commented earlier. She was invited to the kind of an anniversary for the Brown versus Board of Education. And in that written statement to the House of the Representatives in the Standing Committee on Education, she summarized the research and she makes those points that there is an association between school diversity and a range of short and long-term benefits for all students, including gains in math, science, reading, and improved graduation rates. And she proceeds by saying that students show that beyond student achievement, integrated education also contributes to tolerance, cross-cultural understanding, eliminating bias and prejudice, etc., etc. So she sort of points to a significant number of important values. So I would like you to have this with you, that school segregation is an important issue. It is about student sorting, and that is about a resource for what we can do in our schools. So if we look into Sweden, and this is not from our inquiry, it's from the Långtidsutredningen. Someone could maybe translate that from another inquiry, let's say that. We have here two pictures. On the left hand, from your point of view, we have the share of schools in different types of municipalities in relation to school composition. What we have here in the horizontal axis is the same in both. We have students here with weak socioeconomic, lowly educated parents, and here we have strong. And we have the same here. So what we can see from this here is that in the larger cities, we have kids with a stronger and stronger background, which is not that surprising. But what we can see here is when we look into private and public providers of education, it's a huge difference. And it becomes even more clear, this is from our inquiry, that we have in gray here, we have the same kind of scale here, and here we have where the public schools take responsibility for kids, and we can see that there is another profile of those who goes to the private sector. from the same inquiry, we can have a look at this picture. We have this essentially says something about school quality, because here this is adjusted for all figures. So but they're looking at grades, and so what we can take from this picture is that in large cities, blue line, the school quality goes like this. If anyone asks about this, we have different grading systems, so they have tried to sort of map them together. And this is what is happening with school at the countryside at the moment. So to me, that is kind of a terrifying perspective. Where are we going here? And what has happened over time? This is sort of shows the how the student sorting have increased over time. So if we think about students as a resource for learning in schools, when they become more and more assorted, being in schools just with those who are like themselves, it became a disadvantage within the system. We also need to understand that within each and every school, there could be kind of a segregation, because what we have seen in those pictures is the segregation between schools, but we can think about that as something that happens within schools as well. What we know when we had a number of electives earlier in our schools, this is a research group who find that 80% of those stronger, socio-economically stronger students, they was in classes from which 80% of those who are from lower classes were absent. It had to do what kind of elective you did. So, and we can think about that also, that similar patterns prevails in our schools, but with other kind of models. So, that about student sorting. Now, I would say something about the third resource, teacher capacity, teacher competence. So this is from a little bit old study. You can see that it ends here in 2010. And they sort of plotted out here on green, you have schools with high share of students with immigrant background. And you can see that they have a higher level of less qualified teachers. So think about the second report I mentioned initially, that they observed that there were high quality teaching for students that are well off, and a lower quality of teaching for students with high needs. So this of course relates to this question of teacher sorting. So we have an overrepresentation in independent schools. So that is a kind of a contra-intuitive development, as it connects to that they take stronger students. They sort of mitigate some of the problem by accident here, but they are mainly a problem for the low education school. And this is a general pattern within OECD. It's well known that this is a problem. And this is also from Långtidsutredningen, when they look into this and they notice that teaching competence is not allocated according to needs. On the contrary, schools with the most advantaged students tends to have the most competent teachers. So now we have then commented about those important resources: financial resources, teachers' competence, and school segregation, where kind of how students are allocated to schools. And now I can see how much time do I have? That's fine. Okay, I continue. So if I sum this up, we can say that this study shows one of those consequences, meaning that we have a situation now with increased impact of parental level of education. It has more and more importance for student achievement in Swedish school. That is the kind of problem. And I try to see if I can jump to this one, to try to give you an insight on what is happening when we have this kind of system and this kind of contradictive organization of resources. This is from an Australian study. They follow kids from the beginning of schools through the school system, 9 years, and what you have in the yellow line here is kids with highly educated parents, and what you have down here is the low education parents, of course. And when they identify what kind of difference there are in grade 3 already, they translated the difference into month of studies. So they argue that yes, here is a 10-month difference between those who have well-educated parents and those who have not. And then they looked into what is happening over the period. Because the idea of this kind of schooling is that we should reduce that. But what happens is that it increases. So initial and small differences become amplified during the course of studies, nearly to 2 years and 6 months. And in a Swedish perspective, I'm thinking about the fact that we once reorganized education from a 6-year program to a 9-year program, and still I have a sense that yes, maybe we are still here, so to say. I think I skipped that one, and I go over to this part. So how can we understand this this question of educational equity in a kind of a policy, given different policy alternatives? Then we have first to say something about that there are different dimensions of equity in education. Many of the things we look into, it's about either output, where I started. So what is the output of what we do? Then we looked, for example, at input, financial resources, teacher competence, etc. But we must also understand that there is something there in between, a dimension of process, where teaching excellence, leadership, and all those kind of issues, that is so of huge importance. And that was the kind of point in my previous inquiry where I outlined a model for securing this kind of competence. So we need to have this one with us, that when we are speaking about this, there are 3 dimensions of equity, and we are just focusing here on some. I try to understand those resources in a perspective of a communicating vessel. Do you remember that from school, what a communicating vessel is? Meaning that if you pour in water in any of those, what you do here affects what happens in the other. And if you pour out from one, it will be affecting everyone. So I try to understand this as a kind of, we go here. If we think about that those resources I've talked about here, then we need to understand that financial resources, they are essential. We have talked about that. Pedagogical segregation, we have looked into what that is, and student segregation as resources. Meaning that, what are the policy alternatives? Yes, either you have to allocate financial resources strictly in accordance to need. That's one way to do it. But if you cannot do that, because there are either some kind of obstacles for that, then you have to think about how you could allocate students differently, meaning combating school segregation. Or you have to think about how do we reallocate teacher competence to where the needs are highest. Or you could have you have 3 options, and you could sort of go through them, and I don't do that now. But I think this is a way to understand where the policy alternatives are. You could, of course, make a mix, but you cannot say that we cannot avoid doing anything. When we need to understand that what you do here, if you reduce that, it will have impact. If you reallocate competence, it will have impact. But if you don't work here, it doesn't sort of play out properly. So, if I try to end with 2 historical perspectives, I would say that What I've tried to point to here is that this is we have a long history of deep problems here. And Sweden, as in many other countries, have a long history of education, of course. And as you have had a long history of education, you have had a long history of debates on education. And there have always been politically tensed issues here. I offer you here some quotes from a very well-known person from the 1880s. And he made, I think, an interesting analysis. He argued for equal rights to high-quality education for all kids, and he claimed that the current school system harmed society. And he made 2 points. The first one, he said that the current school model rests upon a false foundation, as education in reality is provided for according to social status of parents, and hence society offers children from wealthy families a superior education, and for others a poor and scanty education. Think about where we start. We started out with the important observation. It seems like we are having different quality of classes and teaching for different kind of kids. Second point, he also claimed that the division and fragmentation of the educational system, it caused a kind of partition and disunion within the human mind, and that it suffocates and suppresses the only power that can unite humans into a society, sympathy. And he concludes that no compassion is possible without a shared experience. It was kind of a strong argument that long ago, which I think points towards the problem with the parallel school system. So if we bring that further, we could say that today we look into education, I would say primarily with a quite of a shorter historical perspective, meaning the post-war period. And then the problem of educational inequity, low quality and school segregation, it appears as rather new problems caused by recent reforms, as representing a deviation from a kind of a tradition, something that could be countered rather easily by school reforms. But if we think about this in a more extended historical perspective, departing in the early 1800s, we can see that this thing about inequity, low quality and school segregation, etc., they appears as aspects of a fundamental problem within a societal inequality. And we have also witnessed that it's a part of a strong tradition of a fragmented educational system with weak governing capacity, and creates a system that is rather hard to navigate with a mix of public and private providers of varied quality. And it became, with this perspective, it is something that is threatening to the constitution of our society and for the society as such. So I think given the different historical perspective you apply, you understand the problem differently. I started out with a narrow understanding. I tried to show you the difference between a narrow understanding of education compared with schooling, or a wider notion and the more narrow notion, education and schooling. And then I connected this to the conversation on education, educational equity in a more wider or in a more narrow perspective. And I think this adds into this. That is a significant shift here, which we have to pay attention to. Shall I just conclude with saying something on where we ended in the proposals and the summary? Yeah, quickly? Okay. So the report sort of, we're noticing that the achievement gap is widening. Achievement is related to socioeconomic status, parental level of education, etc., etc. Also that there is a lack, we focus on that there is a lack of annual systemic monitoring of equity. And I think we identified as well that there is a lack of or an insufficient engagement for substantial change. So the key message there are that we are heading in the wrong direction. The situation is deeply troubling. The positive side is that we in fact know how to do things about this. It's not an uncharted territory. We have done this. We did this in the period. If you think about the long historical perspective, we did this in the post-war period. During some decades, we pulled things together and produced a stronger school. So the outcome, sort of the proposals from the inquiry is about that the state, the central authority, needs to take more of a responsibility. We need to set national targets that create insights and support by monitoring and focus efforts on realizing ambitions, not only having them on paper, just to really look through that it will become real. Means that we need to reorganize national agencies into regional actors of kind of a power hubs of competence and capacity for the task. We need to redesign how financial and other resources are allocated, and we have to regulate the school choice and the market model to prevent it from aggravate societal problems and to instead be part of a solution. I think I stop here. I think that is, I've taken too much time already. Thank you.
Thank you very much.